Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thomas Mann and House and Wende Museum Student Council Roundtable for our interview series, Democracy and Vulnerability. My name is Elsa Cooney, and I'm really looking forward to discussing current state of democracy while reflecting on our past year of conversation with my fellow student council members. This year, in 2024, our council had the privilege of engaging in thoughtful conversations with a wide range of politically, socially, and intellectually engaged guest speakers, featuring prominent academics, artists, and activists. Through our 10 thought-provoking interviews, we cover themes that encompassed populism and authoritarianism, misinformation and media, youth and activism, as well as the role of arts, culture, and storytelling in upholding democratic institutions. So the format of today's program is going to be a 1 hour discussion among 5 members of the Student Council: Zora Nelson, Matt Jones, Baruch Dix, Lexi Tooley, and myself. As we reflect on these discussions, discuss the recent election, and deliberate about strategies to adopt going forward. We would also like to extend a heartfelt thank you again to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for their continued support of the Wende Museum's online and in-person programs. I'd like to take this time now to invite each of my council members, Zora, Matt, Baruch, and Lexi, to share a brief introduction about themselves so the audience can get to know each other a little better. About myself, I graduated UCLA this year, and I'm currently working at a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. I've been with the council for almost a year now. Zora, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Elsa, for the introduction. I'm Sora. I will be moderating today's discussion, and I've been a part of the council for the past 2.5 years, I'd say. I'm a senior at NYU studying instrumental performance and double minoring in creative writing and media studies.
Lexi, if you'd like to go next, introduce yourself.
Sure, sorry. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Lexi. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and I'm currently a junior at the University of Pennsylvania, majoring in political science and art history. And I've been working for the program since my senior year of high school. So I'm super excited to be here today.
And then Matt, you could go next.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Jones. I'm just about to start my 4th year of a PhD at Claremont Graduate University, and I study comparative fascism and political memory, often with a focus on museums. So really happy to be here with y'all.
All right, and yeah, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name's Baruch. I'm a third year at UCLA, studying applied mathematics. It's my first year on the Venda, and I'm very excited to have this roundtable discussion today.
All right, well, thank you everyone so much for joining us as we near the end of this chapter of our work and prepare for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead of us. And I'm going to pass it off to Zora to begin moderating our discussion.
Thank you again, everyone. And so, as mentioned, there has been an evident shift in our country these past few weeks, leaving many of us feeling what I would imagine be a diverse range of emotions, hopes, fears, etc. And with this, I know Matt had a point about any possible personal post-election reflections that may have arisen from the context of our quite vivid and on-point discussions this past year.
Perfect. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to get things started off with, what were some of your guys's immediate reactions to the election and kind of in the subsequent aftermath? And how has it been shaped by the series that we've been doing? I maybe see ourselves as kind of like an audience stand-in a way. Like if we've watched, every single one of our seminars and we've learned from all these different scholars, has that actually changed the way that we've interacted with the election and kind of the changes that we've seen since the election happened? So Was there any particular, phrase or bit of wisdom from a speaker that you've reflected on a lot from this year? Or what have been maybe some of the main influences on how you've responded and hope to respond as you move forward?
I mean, I think something that came to mind for me immediately was in the wake of the election, thinking about our interview with the Radical Daughters and thinking about how people work to mobilize communities and inform communities about what's going on, and specifically like pointing out words such as radical, and being able to teach viewers and listeners and community members how to take radical political action. And that might not be something like a massive action in that radical sense, but it could be as far as just like learning more about what's going on around us and just being more informed and educated people in this environment. And I think that they talk a lot about employing courage to navigate the complexities of democracy and of change. And I think that that's something that I definitely had to remind myself of, just being like, I don't know, just make like even a small determination or like self-agency and like having a courageous thought about something difficult is powerful and it can create change. And by informing your friends and other people, that can also do something as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, the first interview that I took part of was with Friedemann Kehrig, who's a German political commentator and author, and it was just interesting to see sort of the contrasts between the two countries, and kind of a stark reminder that the rise of populist movements is not just here in the US, but also global as well. And a lot of what he said about German politics sort of came up during this election as well, which kind of pointed out to the different patterns among these democratic countries that are sort of facing these rise in anti-democratic movements.
Right. It really helped kind of give a context. What's happened in the United States is not just a unique event here, but is something that so many other countries around the world are experiencing simultaneously, which also helps it maybe feel a bit less. It's both more scary in a way because it's a larger problem, but it's also helpful for reducing some of the anxiety because we know kind of where to direct our energies because it's not just out of nowhere that this is happening. And we're not the only ones going through it. So there's like a broader network of people who are working on figuring out, how to prevent further ascension of the far right.
I think you all kind of brought up this interesting point where it really also had me question just the state of our democracy, which we had already been talking about for all these months. But honestly, even before the election, I feel like in the times leading up and all the tension and like seeing things on social media, such as burning like ballot boxes and things like that, I feel like it couldn't have been more on brand with what we have been talking about this past year about how on a global scale, like you mentioned, Matt, it has been kind of troubling. But I think kind of resonating with what you were trying to say, like Lexi, I think this is now like it could have been a better time to now like educate and like mobilize in our communities. And I think that conversation with the Radical Daughters was very impactful in that way. So um moving on, kind of similarly, obviously we are a diverse group of students with a range of talents and expertise. And I know that Elsa had a question that has to do with just what us doing these discussions really means for us, especially as we are a student council and considering the types of figures we've invited.
Yeah, well, this is a reflective question about what you guys think the value of facilitating and moderating these discussions is, especially as a younger generation of students within the context of today's political and social landscape. And then also more specifically, like why a more broad range of figures? Why not just, politicians? What is the value of speaking to creatives such as photographers or writers as well?
I think that having these conversations kind of like allows an audience to like view how like complex like a democratic system is, especially when you're talking to such like a wide range of people. Um, and you kind of draw like similarities to the ways that like a lawyer like John Echohawk or like Tristan Isidore, like how like somebody that's on the school board deals with like passing or like adding things to like a curriculum compared to like somebody who's fighting like civil like class action lawsuits. I feel like that kind of lets you see like how different everybody operates under this like one body or this one like political system, and kind of like how all of these things kind of share similarities but also have like a lot of differences.
I also think just in terms of why I have so many speakers from so many different disciplines and what does that bring? The first thing I thought of when I read that question was just, well, those are also all disciplines or fields of culture or society that are also threatened or attacked by right-wing movements, right? Like you can see in the arts and in education and through legal avenues, like every single one of those you can point toward incursions or destabilizations from the right. And so I think if they're going there, then we also need to be willing to go there as well and not just simply give them up or see them as, unnecessary for preserving democracy.
Um, yeah, I think I really resonate with what you were saying, Brooke, which is like at the end of the day, we do all operate under one political body. And I think I really one of my favorite things about being a part of the council is that we do like invite so many different kinds of people, but um like you were both saying, it's kind of interesting because at the end of the day, we all feel the same, and it's like it's just what we have chosen to do about that, which has been really interesting, and important, especially for the youth. And moving on, similarly to what we were talking about, and kind of like congruent with like what we're doing right now. I do think, however, it is easy to find ourselves in these echo chambers, whether that be geographically. I mean, I live in New York City, so that's its own thing, or it's like on social media, and even our council. And I know Elsa kind of has a question that has to do with that.
Yeah, thank you, Zora. We've had a really nice broad range of, I think, people that come from different professions, and also people from different walks of life, like people from different countries. Um, and I do wonder, however, how they might not be so different in political ideology or political opinions, and if by just echoing what we're all thinking, how effective that can be. So, I'm not saying let's invite, the fascist on here, but like, is it possible that we have maybe restrained ourselves from having more difficult conversations by inviting speakers who think very similarly to ourselves? I can also add that, like, I think it's not just the people that we invite on here, who are all just very well established, very intelligent people, but maybe the kind of viewers that the panel interview series attracts as well. And it might be falling into like, yeah, just kind of echoing what we're all already thinking. And then in order to like to reach the people that might actually benefit from hearing this, we might just be talking to people that already feel the same way as us, if that kind of makes sense. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts about that, and reaching out to maybe people with a broader range of political opinions.
Yeah, also I think this is a really um I think a really just like raw question that you bring up that I feel like we haven't talked about much before, but I think this kind of touches on something I was going to bring up later on about our Allison Lee interview, where she was basically talking about how like she feels as though the most authentic practice of like the First Amendment is like listening to opinions that you don't agree with, or like vice versa. Like that is what that means to for her. And I think considering again the echo chamber thing, I was talking about recently, like, we are a student council, which comes with its privileges. Like we are all pretty well educated. And I think I would imagine we all surround ourselves with those people too, just because we're also all in school. And I think it was just interesting to see, I guess, the shock factor after the election results, because there is obviously a very clear divide with education level and like other statuses when it comes to like the results. And I think it was interesting to see the shock from a lot of students from institutions like our own. But I think it is very important to step outside of ourselves and come more like in like, harmony with like reality, because at the end of the day, we do have the privilege to live in these um bubbles. And although we have very amazing conversations, I do wonder what it would be like if we did start inviting people who had starkly different opinions than us. So it's really interesting.
I mean, I guess it depends on what we hope the effects of these interviews are. Like, are we looking to, maybe persuade people of different opinions, or, who are we hoping to reach? And I guess the way that I've been viewing what we're doing has been more of like a workshop or brainstorming session that kind of shapes us to then be able to have these conversations outside of, this 1 hour, once a month, where, maybe the idea is that it inspires us toward courage or toward, creativity in how we go and talk to people in our own lives. Because I think one of the sort of truisms of political discourse is that people don't really change their minds listening to strangers. Um, and that includes just kind of, tuning in and listening to a lovely panel of wonderful students. But not having that personal connection can, often, make it harder to, people resist changing their minds based off of that. But if there's real relationship, that's where discourse can happen and where minds can be changed. And so I guess I saw, you know, perhaps the greatest benefit of this time was not so much, these conversations pushing back against, far right ideologies or people who might believe far right things, so much as empowering us with more nuanced, more creative, more resilient understandings of the world and our political system and the vulnerabilities of democracy, and then empowering us to go and have those conversations with the people who we love and who we do have relationships with. And even in that way, our communities become, stronger because it's got that personal heart-to-heart element to it.
I really like that viewpoint on it, and even the use of the word workshop, like it similarly to the workshop that I know we both attended over the summer at the Radical Daughters. I think that is a really good way of looking at it, where it's like through these conversations. I mean, a lot of the people we've had these discussions with have told us about like real life things that they're doing. And it's more of a question. It's like, well, how can we, if we feel so inclined, possibly start to implement those things? And I do think that is quite empowering. So um, moving on just a little bit. I know Baruch has a question that has to do more so with democratic processes and its potential pitfalls.
Yeah, over like the last year, we've kind of like had a lot of conversations with people that kind of point out like a lot of the shortcomings that happen in like our democratic processes. And I was kind of like wondering, especially after the election, like what like specific stories or messages or like even like things that were said during like these conversations that have like come to like that have had you guys question our political or democratic system, or even or like if you have already questioned it, like question it in a different way or seen it in a different light.
I think one that stands out to me specifically is our interview with John Echohawk. just because he spoke so much about how the as an attorney, he says that Native Americans, which they do have the right to determine their own future, and they speak about their own sovereignty and self-agency over property, land, history, and like, I don't know, withholding democracy. Yet he spoke about the different obstacles that he encountered throughout his entire career that clearly like went against that statement. And I think that even though we speak about democracy and even though we learn of like the progression throughout history, there are these obstacles that marginalized and oppressed groups still experience and are still experiencing. And especially when we're hearing about the things that he's done in the past 5 years, like months, and what he's been fighting for, it's disheartening to hear more about how the logistics of our political and democratic process go against the lives and the livelihoods of so many people that live within it.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing about the John Echo Hawk interview, and I think that also just emphasized how important it is to have members of those marginalized groups be in roles like lawyers or politicians, because even, the fair and free voting system that we have doesn't always apply to all communities equally. Like him giving the example of reservation homes not having street addresses and therefore not being able to cast their ballot, which was something that I had never even thought of. So it's important to have those voices in the room to make sure that every community can be heard in the democratic process.
Yeah, I really agree with everything you're both saying. I think the unfortunate reality is there are still many obstacles that a lot of these marginalized groups do have to face. And I like what you said also about like making sure, I mean, the most we can do is make sure that those voices are in the room so we can like work towards trying to break those systems down. And I had a talking point that was kind of a good segue from this. It was from our interview with Refunda Rudin on and this topic was more so about like what it means to be an American. And I have a quote, and he said that race is fundamental to America's understanding of itself. To understand the founding of America and American identity without talking about race is a travesty. Race is fundamentally locked into what it means to be an American. And I just really wanted to know you guys' thoughts on that because I thought that was a very just like visceral statement I think there.
Yeah, I was part of the group that interviewed him, and I thought what was so compelling about how he framed like that particular observation you made is that he paired that with the understanding of democracy as an actual system being so much more than just whether or not we vote every 4 years or if we have elections, right? He said democracy is the quality of a democracy is how it protects and cares for the rights of its minority communities in between elections when these minority communities are not politically useful. When the eyes are not, all turned toward people's political actions. And I think what he was pointing out too, right, was that, for so long, yeah, we had elections, but the quality of American democracy was such that it was specifically created or run in a way that denied, Black people the right to vote, that denied women the right to vote until much later, that very much intentionally excluded people from not just the process of voting itself, but also the possibilities of being protected and represented and cared for by the democratic government in between elections as well. And yeah, I thought he said that so long as unless we change our understanding of democracy to be more focused on, how is it caring for and protecting these underrepresented minority communities in between elections, then, and if we're only focused on having elections or how we vote, then that's just democracy promotion. right? It's not actually the democratic process or a democratic government. And that I think was really helpful for me because it shows how even though you know, people can vote, that doesn't necessarily mean that, our democracy is flourishing or functioning, especially when you look at the way that our democracy has historically disenfranchised multiple minority communities and specifically, Black Americans. Yeah, I really appreciated that particular vision that he offered about how to analyze our democracy and its health.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up, Matt. I think this idea of like reframing our ideas of democracy, the more so being this idea of like protection. And I think the whole point about focusing on what is the actual process rather than this just like kind of um shallow like democratic promotion, I think reigns very true. And
Can I
I
follow up really quick on that after you're done? Yeah.
I was just gonna say that like it just, especially when it comes to things like voting in particular and just like how limiting that still is, I think it really does go to show that like the foundations of this country are like inherently exclusionary, despite these ideas of liberty, and everything. But I'll let you add on to that.
No, I think that's totally true. And it made me think about the name of our series, right? It's Democracy and Vulnerability. And I've been thinking of it primarily in terms of what makes our democracy vulnerable. But at the same time, thinking of Dr. Noureddin's lecture and what we were just talking about in terms of like the disenfranchisement across various, you know, communities is the vulnerability of democracy is the vulnerable people that it's supposed to be protecting. And to maybe think of not just how is our democracy vulnerable, but like, is it democracy if it's also not caring for the vulnerable? And what does it mean for it to even be a democracy so long as there are such vulnerable, disenfranchised communities that it doesn't care for?
Yeah, I honestly think vulnerable is the like perfect word to talk about this. And I think um I just wanted to mention a quote that does like touch on more so the vulnerable side of things between all of us. And it was a quote from Audrey Mance on this liberating feeling of loving who society tells you not to, and just like the power in choosing love and resisting societal polarization. And she says that there's a power that resists the big business of not liking yourself or other people who are different by encouraging you to see your own empowerment through loving and celebrating groups of whom you're not a part. And I think that couldn't like not be just a perfect way to encapsulate what you're saying, thinking about just like, you know, how the other people around us may be vulnerable to the system that we find ourselves in. So I just wanted to share that. But moving on, Baruch has a question more specifically about socioeconomic factors, specifically within a democracy.
I feel like Matt, you touched a lot on this like in the last question, but I was just kind of thinking about how like yeah, like socioeconomic factors do play a role in your ability to access a democratic system. Like somebody who has like a felony or something like that, they can't vote. Like a lot of things become out of reach based on your own like class. And so, if those things are true and we exist in a system where people are not able to participate in the same way that like anybody else can in a democratic system, is this practice truly democratic? Uh,
I feel like I
oh,
saw this. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
oh. And then like a follow-up was that is anything truly democratic if like the entire state cannot contribute equally?
That's a really good question. I think that also kind of delves into like deeper philosophical questions about just like the definition of democracy. But I saw this a lot, I feel like, in this most recent one, this most recent election. I would see pictures of people waiting in line for like 3 hours because they could only get to the polls like later in the day. It's not a federal holiday, so everyone doesn't have the day off, and not everyone, in fact, most people probably can't afford to just take the day off. And so in that, just like the system of actually casting your ballot and making your voice heard in that way is not always democratic. But then to the second part of your question about like whether any system is truly democratic, I don't think it really is. I don't think that necessarily means that we can't all strive to make it as democratic as possible. But yeah, I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that.
I think from what from Matt and Baruch and also like I think the main takeaway that I've gathered is honestly just a matter of like no, and we have a lot of work to do. Unfortunately, especially despite our country being at its age. But I do think again with that quote from Audre Mance, I have some hope. And I think you guys are part of the reason that I have that hope. So thank you. Moving on a little bit, we're going to speak more specifically about art. And Lexi had a question about art's specific role in terms of reworking our democracy.
Yes, thank you. Also, just to quickly add on to what you just said, Zora, I think that going back, I've just been thinking about the Radical Daughters interview a lot, and they said in response to Baruch's question, like, to create change, you need to ground the initiative of change in collaboration. And I think that in these situations, when we find that democracies are vulnerable and that they are, like, these systems are out of reach to some people, that's when we turn to collaboration within communities to work to create change and work to find a common ground with like our neighbors to then inform and educate and inspire others. Because without that, there's no action and there's no movement. But that was just my thought. Anyways, my question about art and democracy was referring to our interview with Catherine Opie. Catherine Opie said that the camera lens is democratic. How can art be an avenue for democracy and change? And have we recently seen any mass moves towards art as a way for community members to express their opinions and feelings or to reclaim agency in a time when democracy feels very vulnerable?
Well, I'm just curious, Zora, you're an artist, do you have, I'd be most interested to hear your opinion here.
I think honestly, being an artist and having the privilege to live in a city like New York, I think it is quite beautiful seeing just like how much activism here is like surrounded by art, whether that be through murals or even just like performances at protests. And just like exhibitions that have like a specific like activist like angle. I've definitely seen a lot of that in New York, and um, I think it really is a beautiful way of expressing those things given our current state um, in democracy being a bit troubling. And I think that is another thing that kind of like feels very refreshing to see like people taking like people asserting their individualism through things like art, because at the end of the day, although there have been methods to try to take that away, even like you can't really take away someone's like that part of their brain. So that's been really refreshing to see.
I'm curious, just to add on, what this might look like in the future months and years in terms of censorship and a turn to art as a way to express vulnerability and feelings versus government censorship or social media censorship or just what that might look like in the coming ages. I think that might be very interesting, especially, I mean, my classes that I'm taking right now, I'm looking at like the history of art in curatorial spaces and how censorship has interacted with exhibitions throughout America. And I'm just wondering how that might change the future of art in various spaces to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think regarding censorship, we often think of censorship as, oh, they're banning certain images or they're saying like we're not allowed to talk about these particular topics. But one of the core elements of censorship is controlling definitions. So you see it all the time in terms of, let's just talk about like trans people, right? Or like where there's a lot of debates over specific language and defining like is trans art suddenly pornographic or something like that. And you see that's the language that they're using in some of the laws that they're passing in like in Tennessee or other places where they're finding ways to uh claim that by presenting as a gender apart from the one that you were assigned at birth, that that's a form of like of pornography, of like that it's inherently sexual, and then that can be banned from the public. So there's elements in terms of how we talk about censorship that I think we need to be more aware of, like of it happening before the bans hit, or before they say, oh, we're banning pornography or something like that. The question has to be like, how are they defining these things? And we have to be able to push back kind of at that level, because I think that's how sometimes we get caught on our back feet. And so similarly with art and other things, that's been a constant source of a part of the battle of censorship is who gets to define what is art, and what is worth looking at, versus what can be harming and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's really, yeah, it's just going to be exhausting, I think.
This conversation is reminding me of that art installation that was, I mean, this is a little dramatic comparison, but I just mean that the Nazis put up of like all the Dadaism and all of the abstract art that had been introduced during the Weimar Republic in the 20s as like examples of bad art, pretty much. I forget the actual name of the exhibit, but it ended up being degenerate art. Yeah, exactly. And it ended up being, I think, the most visited art exhibition during that time, which I think speaks to the provocation of that kind of art. And I think, we might see like a lot of bad poetry in the next couple years, but I'm really looking forward to everyone being able to express themselves through that in like an act of defiance as well.
I am looking forward to that as well. Because again, I just feel like just art as a form of response or protest is just like, I think, and that sense of individualism is just always very powerful. And Matt, you mentioned this idea of like censorship being controlling definitions. And I think social media could not be like in like our current scenario now could not be a better like example of like how that's like happening before our eyes. I mean, something that actually came to mind that is a little more unserious than what you brought up, but still kind of frustrating is just the way the word woke has just been turned into this like right wing thing. And like, I'll honestly never forgive them for that. And I just think just like this appropriation of just language as well has just been really troubling. But this kind of has to do with my next point I was going to bring up actually, with our interview with Allison Lee, because we talked all about censorship. And I kind of touched on this earlier. And the quote is that I'm here to protect the speech that I don't agree with. We are no longer comfortable interrogating difference. This is when we need the words. This is when we need the writers. This is why they are trying to suppress these stories. Um, and I know that we were talking a lot with her, especially with the context of book banning. Um, and I guess specifically with books and journalism, I was wondering if you guys had any like thoughts on that or like fears given the current times.
I feel like how education has been progressively being attacked by like our future administration. Like I don't know. I feel like books are kind of like, or academia is like that one stand-in where like you can always get something that is like unfiltered and true. And uh that is like slowly being like taken away from us. I feel like that's something that I'm kind of like at fear with. But yeah.
Just to add, we this is kind of just like an echo of what Matthew was speaking about before with um like about censorship, but it makes me think of things like the erasure of critical race theory in schools in like southern states. And um I don't know, it just makes me nervous because as Baruch said, usually schools are where we turn to find our information, and the Department of Education and all of those different institutions. And with things that I don't know are being suppressed now, it's going to be more and more difficult to fight for truth and an unfiltered truth, which is already difficult to find and has been difficult to find. But it's just going to make it a little more, I don't know, demanding to continue to learn.
Yeah, I know education has been a big thing that's been on my mind, especially in these last few weeks, which is kind of ironic. We're talking about this today, given recent news about the Department of Education, the future of that. But yeah, I do think unfortunately we are in a place where education is being attacked um through various different ways. And yeah, it's just kind of disheartening. But moving on to a different topic. Lexi has a few or two questions about the study of collective memory and global image politics.
So I really thought that, well, from referring to our interview with Sophie Charlotte Opitz, and she conducted studies on collective memory and global image politics. And I was wondering which events from the past few months you guys think will be most influential in shaping these global image politics in our American slash international collective memory in the future.
It's a good question. I need to think. This is maybe a cop out, but I feel like it, in a sense, like the media or the public are still kind of deciding, right? Like you can see after the election ended, there's been a mad scramble to explain what happened, and people have been pulling images and pulling news articles from the last 3 to 8 months to try to say like this is when it turned, or like, oh, this was actually emblematic of what was going on and we didn't see it at the time. So I'm not sure, right? Like I feel like there's been a couple images that stand out, but I think more than anything, it's been the sort of chaos of the post-election news cycle where people are just trying to understand what happened. And explain it. And eventually, maybe when that settles into a more stable narrative, then the image will sort of emerge from that again. But yeah, there have been so many. That's what's crazy about our election cycles. So unfortunately, there's just an oversaturation of images, I think. So yeah, I'm not sure.
I think also like an oversaturation of like collective memory, because I mean, I'm on a college campus in Pennsylvania, which was a major space that was targeted for the election. And like, like forever in my mind will be ingrained like thousands of students outside, like waiting in lines to vote, like lobbying or not lobbying, but just like advocating for the presidential candidates and just coming together in group settings to inform others and just be together. And I think that that's such a significant like memory that I'll have forever. Like I'll absolutely never forget this, but I completely agree. I feel like once the dust kind of settles in the future, something will emerge, and it's just kind of up to us determine what that will be based on what happens.
Yeah, you guys bring up some interesting points about this, and I think specifically the oversaturation of images um really had me thinking because I mean I know at least over the summer I remember that image after Donald Trump got shot in the ear circulating. And I remember hearing from a lot of my peers, and also just like online from people I don't necessarily know, just like how that may have affected people's brains or what emotions that may have elicited in like his supporters, or even non-supporters. So I think it will be interesting to see how like images and the media plays a role in this next term. But moving on, I wanted to bring a quote that kind of brings a lighter note, just about from our conversation with the Radical Daughters that I know me and Lexi have mentioned a few times. And it's actively engage in hope, see it as something that you can learn every day. And I remember a moment in that interview that was really special is people like giving their responses of how they are radical in their everyday lives. And I guess I wanted to like bring that back and ask if there's any new ways that you guys have practiced being radical slash how do you find hope, especially given the context of the last 2 weeks.
I feel like this has come up, but like I think as like time has gone on, like collaboration, like coming together is like that beacon of hope, or is like what inspires like someone to look to the future. Like being able to have like a framework of people is it kind of like lifts you up and allows you to like look forward without like dwelling in the past. Like I remember in our last interview, like one of the last things um Marla said was like I hope like after this election, like people aren't like just like talking about it, but are like in the streets. Like kind of like continuing like the fight is like kind of what like creates hope.
I would also say just like speaking with you guys as well, and hearing people speak from not just an educated, rounded, nuanced standpoint, but also out of kindness and support for other people. Also, just the in-person event we had. Honestly, I wasn't expecting that many people to come, and the fact that so many people did come to hear us speak, I found very inspiring and very hopeful. Looking forward in the future that there's always going to be people out there that are looking to engage in those discussions as well.
Yeah, and I know something specifically that the Radical Daughters were really focusing in on was the youth and them believing that, obviously it is the youth that is our future and that they can make a change or quote, then democracy has failed us. And I think as, all young people, do you like how are we feeling in terms of whether or not it is up to us or how effective that may be? I guess I'm just interested to know, like, because we are the youth in question, right? Like, how do you guys feel about that? I don't know if things have shifted at all also on anyone's campuses specifically in the past 2 weeks, but that's also something I've been thinking about.
I feel like personally, like I'm excited sometimes. Like my main feeling is like excitement because I feel like when I come in spaces like this and I can speak with all of the people that we've interviewed throughout the year, it instills hope within me that something will change based on our action and based on our efforts to educate each other and ourselves and come together and, just talk. But it is hard to maintain excitement when there are a lot of things threatening to our democracy and like our livelihoods going on at the same time. But I think that like I don't know if I'm even answering your question fully. I think I'm getting sidetracked, but like for the most part, I think it's like us and the hope for a future where we might have some power and some control and where we can influence those that might have the same kind of thoughts as us.
I agree. And I think something they also brought up was about, you know, this idea of kind of questioning everything and not just accepting the circumstances. And I think at least where I'm from, like I'm from Philly, another big city, and like now I live in New York. And I think I have been a part of or witnessed movements that are just this exact example of not accepting the status quo. So I think that gives me hope as well. Um, Moving on a little bit on an even more personal level, Elsa, I know had a question about just our personal relationships with democracy.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to hear if you guys have had any personal experiences with the council or otherwise that have influenced or shaped your understanding of democracy's vulnerabilities.
Thinking about like John Echohawk's uh inter or discussion. I remember I had one question about like COVID and like he said the reason it like hit so hard was because there of like an in access to like fresh water or like clean water. And I feel like I'm the last time like I really heard about like water rights or like not being able to have like cl access to clean water was like the Flint, like Michigan, like all of uh those like the lead in the water. And I think like after that I kind of like delved deeper and I kind of found out that there was like there's a history of and it's still ongoing of like people who don't have access to clean running water or don't have like access to like running water in general. And in that way, like everybody's like here, like they exist in this place that's supposed to have all of these checks and balances, and like regardless of the of that thing, like it still falls through, and these people.
Yeah, I think that's a really unfortunate example that you bring up. And I think I guess what came to mind with me um is I think there has been a lot of displays of um democracy in terms of their First Amendment rights, at least I know on New York campuses in the last 6 months. And I think something that specifically has reminded me of like this vulnerability aspect was just I guess the pushback of a lot of protests in the past months and just like especially with like heavy police presence. I don't know about you guys, but I think my campus, like NYU, has almost felt like a little bit like a military state, like even like months after when there aren't necessarily protests going on. But ever since that like era in the spring where there was a lot of noise being made, there has definitely been a shift and a change, which has been kind of interesting to witness, especially like given like I guess academia's role in all of this, especially like with higher institutions. So that's what came to mind for me. But just to wrap things up a little bit, I do want to end with one more question that I think will be a nice note to end on. And Matt wanted to touch on some dreams, hopes, and lessons we have learned in the midst of it all.
For sure, yeah. Maybe just, yeah, a slightly more forward-looking, hopeful angle is just, 4 years from now, there's another election, right? But we've also learned that democracy isn't just about, what happens each 4 years, right? And so I was just wondering, it's, I think easy to look forward like over the next couple years with the next administration and see like, darkness or that our agency will be limited, our options will be limited. But what are still some meaningful dreams you have for yourself? By the time the next election rolls around, how do you think you'll have changed? Like, how do you think you'll have grown? Who do you hope to be? And kind of how has our series this year perhaps changed the path forward for you over these next 4 years?
Well, I'm curious to know what your answer is to that first.
So this one, it was an interesting election for me because I'm in my doctorate. I'm getting my doctorate and I'm studying fascism, right? So the overwhelming feeling for me was like, no, not now. Like I don't, I'm still learning all these things. I'm still figuring out how to talk about this. And there was that feeling of like not being quite prepared to really contend with it in the public sphere. And so I think I was really energized by our conversations, and I even networked with a lot of our speakers. And when 4 years rolls around, I'll have my degree and I'll be able to, I think, maybe more um, collaboratively and maybe more forcefully enter into public discourse and kind of shape it that way. And also after the election, I started, volunteering at a local food distribution center. And I think it was just a reminder of both expanding my vocation and my sense of, occupation and those kind of more professional dreams, but also, shrinking to a degree, like getting more local too, taking a root in my community and learning what are the immediate needs that I can help with in the meantime.
Matt, I just think it's funny that someone in their fourth PhD year studying fascism would say that they don't know enough about it to combat it. Because if that's true, then yeah, we're really screwed.
Yeah, never-ending imposter syndrome, I guess.
That's really funny, but I think regardless, you just did raise a very beautiful question there, and I really like this idea of like, Rue and just like, staying on the ground, which I think was really inspiring after again our conversation with Radical Daughters, because I do think that is the best, most tangible way to approach things. And thinking about my answer to your question, I guess for me, my hope is to hold even more empathy for others and with also this hope for others to do the same, because I think these past few years with politics, I think honestly, and everything on social media, I've just learned that I think that there is kind of an apathetic nature to our country, and I think I can only hope for it by showing it to others, even when I may not want to. So I think that's my answer to your question. But regardless, we are at time. And thank you all for our roundtable discussion. This was very, I think it was a really good way to reflect on last year. And I just want to end by saying to everyone, I hope that you join us next month for our closing to the Democracy and Vulnerability series.